On their very first morning at Highgrove as husband and wife, Charles and Camilla must have felt as if they were surveying a kingdom they had finally conquered after decades of siege. Outside their windows stretched orchards heavy with heritage apples, rows of organic vegetables gleaming with dew, and rare breed sheep grazing in quiet dignity. This was no ordinary royal estate. It was the prize at the end of a long, bitter story, a retreat where scandal had once lingered but where redemption would eventually bloom. Highgrove was never meant to be a palace of marble and chandeliers. Instead, it became a manifesto written in stone, soil, and silence. The couple's devotion to horses, hunting, and conservation unfolded across 353 acres of Gloucestershire countryside, far from the suffocating rituals of court life. Here, Charles was not the aloof heir to the throne, but the country squire who spoke to his plants, the visionary who saw a future where tradition and sustainability could live side by side. And beside him, at last, was the woman who had shared his exile from public approval, now elevated to Queen of the Gardens. For Charles, Highgrove was more than property. It was identity. The ashlar stone walls rose from the earth like something ordained, glowing with that golden Cotswolds warmth that could make even cynics shed a patriotic tear. Within those walls, 9 bedrooms and 6 bathrooms were arranged with Georgian precision, but it was never about numbers. It was about belonging to the land, to heritage, to a dream. And yet, how did this neglected estate, once scarred by fire and decline, transform into the ultimate showcase of royal environmentalism? How did a future king turn a forgotten manor into a global model for sustainable living, long before organic was fashionable? And perhaps the most curious question of all, why does this place, nestled in the hills of Gloucestershire, feel more like Charles's true crown than the one resting in the Tower of London? Welcome to Highgrove House, King Charles III's private country estate, a jewel hidden in the rolling fields of the Cotswolds, where every garden tells a secret and every stone whispers a story. Drive just 2 miles southwest of the charming market town of Tetbury, and suddenly, the Gloucestershire countryside unfolds like a painting. Rolling green hills stretch into the horizon, dotted with honey-colored stone villages that look as if they've been frozen in time. And there, standing quietly yet commandingly among the hedgerows and fields, is Highgrove House, an estate so quintessentially English it could make even the most hardened Republican pause for breath. At first glance, the house doesn't shout for attention. It doesn't need to. Built in the late Georgian period, Highgrove embodies restraint, a masterclass in proportion and balance. Its 3 stories rise with symmetrical perfection, the kind of architectural discipline that whispers refinement. The ashlar stone facade glows with a soft golden light unique to the Cotswolds, making other building materials look almost crude by comparison. The entrance alone feels like a conversation between mathematics and poetry. Giant pilasters frame the front, their presence both grand and disciplined, while a Venetian window, perfectly centered above the door, gazes outward with serene composure. Above it all, a slate roof has weathered centuries of storms and seasons, bearing the kind of dignity only time can bestow. This is a house that doesn't flaunt wealth but asserts taste, in the quiet confidence of an era when vulgarity meant nothing more than mentioning money at the dinner table. Step inside, and the story deepens. 9 bedrooms are spread across the upper floors, a royal household's needs carefully accommodated without descending into ostentation. 6 bathrooms, discreet but ample, ensure even the most elaborate house parties flow without interruption. But it is the ground floor, with its 4 reception rooms, that reveals the true character of Highgrove. Here, tradition meets comfort, royal grandeur mingles with country coziness, and guests discover a place designed for both intimate family moments and the kind of entertaining that defines a monarchy. Inside, you don't feel as though you've entered a museum curated for tourists. Instead, it feels like a home. Persian rugs soften creaking floorboards that have carried generations. Family portraits gaze down from paneled walls, their eyes locked on the present with approval. The furniture is a blend of traditional English country style and treasures from the royal collection, pieces that remind you of history while remaining lived in. It's a delicate balance, formal yet familiar, regal yet warm. And this, perhaps, is the magic of Highgrove. It does not overwhelm you with gilded ceilings or echoing marble halls. It disarms you with its humanity. It reminds you that even a king needs a place to sit comfortably by the fire, to walk barefoot across wooden floors, to feel at home. But if the house itself is a poem in stone, then the true masterpiece lies just beyond its walls. For what Charles built outside these Georgian rooms would not only define Highgrove, but reshape the very idea of what a royal estate could mean. Step outside Highgrove's Georgian walls, and the story takes a dramatic turn. Here, Charles's vision unfolds not in marble, but in meadows, not in gilded ceilings, but in blossoms and hedgerows. The 15 acres of gardens surrounding the house are perhaps the most famous in Britain today, not for their grandeur, but for their principles. They are the purest expression of Charles's lifelong belief that sustainability, tradition, and beauty can and must coexist. Each section of the garden is like a chapter in a botanical novel, each corner carrying its own voice. The cottage garden explodes with color in a way that looks delightfully unplanned, though every bloom has been placed with meticulous care. Delphiniums rise proudly, roses climb with abandon, and the entire display feels as though nature herself designed it. But make no mistake, it takes enormous skill to create a garden that looks this effortless. Just a few steps away, the wildflower meadow sways in the wind, a sea of native blooms planted back in 1982, long before rewilding became fashionable. Bees hum in the air, butterflies drift lazily above the blossoms, and one begins to understand why Charles was mocked in the 1980s as eccentric for his organic obsessions. Today, those very ideas feel prophetic. Then there is the stumpery, perhaps the most peculiar of all. Fallen tree trunks have been deliberately arranged into Gothic sculptures, creating an otherworldly scene where shade-loving ferns and plants thrive. Imagine Tim Burton sketching a fairy tale and seeing it come alive in moss and wood. That is the atmosphere here. Strange, whimsical, and hauntingly beautiful. The sundial garden, on the other hand, offers a Mediterranean flavor, its central timepiece surrounded by aromatic lavender, rosemary, and thyme. The thick yew hedges create a sheltered microclimate where even delicate herbs can flourish in the English weather. It's elegance with a purpose, every design element echoing Charles's obsession with harmony between man and nature. And then there is the kitchen garden, the estate's most practical treasure. Rows of organic vegetables, berries, and fruit trees feed the table at Highgrove with produce that would make even the trendiest London restaurant chef envious. In an era when farm-to-table dining is marketed as luxury, Charles was quietly living it decades earlier. Here, sustainability is not a slogan, it's dinner. But Highgrove is not without its modern comforts. The swimming pool, tucked discreetly behind the greenery, is almost easy to miss. It was a wedding gift to Charles and Diana from the British Army in 1981, and its placement is a perfect example of the estate's design philosophy. Even indulgence should bow to nature. What makes these gardens so remarkable is not just their beauty, but their intention. Every hedge, every flower bed, every orchard tree tells the same story, that the land is not something to dominate, but something to collaborate with. Even security, which in most royal residences is obtrusive and obvious, here blends invisibly into the pastoral scene. It protects without announcing itself, just as the gardens themselves inspire without ever feeling contrived. For Charles, the gardens became his escape, his laboratory, his sermon. And for visitors, whether foreign dignitaries or curious members of the public, they became a revelation. Step through the gates, and you are not entering a royal park. You are walking into the inner life of a king. But how did this vision come to be? To understand Highgrove's transformation, we must return to its beginnings, to the French Huguenot refugees, the Georgian gentry, the devastating fire, and the slow decline that nearly erased the estate, until a young Prince Charles stepped in to rescue it. Long before it became a sanctuary for a future king, Highgrove began as the dream of a very different family. Its story stretches back to the late 18th century, when England was brimming with confidence, and architecture was the language of ambition. The tale starts not with blue blood, but with immigrants, the French Huguenot clothiers who fled persecution on the continent. In a twist of fate that could only belong to history, their descendants would one day provide a home for a British monarch. Between 1796 and 1798, John Paul commissioned what would become one of Gloucestershire's most significant country houses. His wealth was not ancient inheritance, but the product of trade and strategic marriage. His father, Josiah Paul Tippets, who later simplified his name to Paul, secured the estate in 1771 by marrying heiress Mary Clark. It was proof of a timeless truth. In England, land was power, and marriage could be as effective as conquest. For the design, Paul turned to Anthony Keck, a provincial architect whose name may not ring through history books, but whose work quietly shaped the countryside across Gloucestershire, Worcestershire, and South Wales. Keck's reputation rested on his restrained neoclassical style. Where others might build to impress, Keck built to endure. His philosophy was simple: elegance whispers, it does not shout. At Highgrove, he created symmetry without rigidity, balance without ostentation, and a facade that radiated refinement rather than grandeur. The house stood as a gentleman's country seat, more a family home than a palace of ceremony. That subtlety would one day prove prescient, for when Charles inherited it centuries later, he needed not a court, but a retreat. Still, the estate's path through time was anything but smooth. The Paul family maintained Highgrove until 1860, when it passed to barrister William Hamilton Yatman. His ownership was marked by generosity, funding the restoration of Tetbury Church's medieval spire in 1872 and rehanging its bells in 1891, but also by tragedy. In 1893, catastrophe struck. Fire tore through Highgrove, gutting its interior and collapsing part of the west facade. Centuries of craftsmanship were reduced to smoldering ruins. Yatman, by then elderly, faced a cruel choice: rebuild at staggering expense or sell and walk away. He chose the latter. The estate was purchased by A.C. Mitchell, who hired John Hart of Bristol to reconstruct the interiors within the surviving shell. The result was a simplified version of Keck's original, a house that preserved Georgian dignity while accommodating late Victorian conveniences. Later, the estate passed to Mitchell's son, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Mitchell, who tied Highgrove's story to both military service and local society. By the mid-20th century, however, the estate had begun to fade. Maurice Macmillan, son of future Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, acquired Highgrove in 1956, but allowed both house and gardens to slip into decline. Like so many English country estates after the war, it carried the air of gentle neglect, a place whose glory was fading, waiting for someone to rescue it. That rescue came in 1980, when the Duchy of Cornwall purchased the property for somewhere between $1 million and $2 million. To most, Highgrove looked tired: overgrown fields, hollow oaks, and a house in need of vision. But to Charles, then Prince of Wales, it was a blank canvas. A retreat within reach of London, and more importantly, a stage on which he could experiment with the agricultural and environmental philosophies that would soon define him. And so, Highgrove entered a new chapter. Its past, filled with marriages of convenience, architectural whispers, fiery destruction, and genteel decline, gave way to a future where a prince would attempt something no royal had before: to turn an estate into a living manifesto of sustainability. When Prince Charles purchased Highgrove in 1980, it was more than a real estate decision. It was an act of imagination. To most observers, the estate looked weary: an overgrown copse, a neglected kitchen garden, and pastures that seemed to have surrendered to time. But Charles saw potential. He envisioned a sanctuary where his passions for conservation and organic farming could take root, a retreat that balanced both tradition and innovation. It was a bold gamble, and at first he was not alone in it. The following year, he brought his new bride, Diana, Princess of Wales, into Highgrove. At first, she embraced it with youthful enthusiasm. The Gloucestershire countryside offered a break from the relentless protocols of London, a quiet escape from the public glare. The British Army's extravagant wedding gift, a swimming pool tucked discreetly into the grounds, seemed to signal a fresh beginning. To the world, Highgrove looked like the perfect stage for the fairy tale marriage everyone wanted to believe in. But country life did not suit Diana as it did Charles. For him, the estate's pastoral calm was a refuge. For her, it became a cage. London's vibrancy, the social circles she craved, and the rhythm of city life were far away. Slowly, the same meadows that gave Charles peace became symbols of isolation for his wife. Still, Highgrove became a family home in ways that would define William and Harry's childhoods. The young princes ran across its lawns, rode ponies in its fields, and built their own memories within its walls. Most famously, they had Club H, a teenage hideaway in the basement complete with disco lights and sound systems. Behind the heavy curtains of tradition, the princes carved out a space for something approaching normal adolescence. The estate also hosted salons and gatherings, where Charles invited environmentalists, philosophers, and spiritual advisors. It became a quiet hub of intellectual life, where Sufi mystics might mingle with conservationists, long before such causes were mainstream. Guests described Highgrove as half family home, half experimental workshop for Charles's ideas. But no house, however grand, could remain untouched by the turmoil of its occupants. As Charles's bond with Camilla Parker Bowles deepened, the estate became part of a secret story the tabloids would eventually seize upon. The infamous Tampon Gate phone call of 1993, allegedly conducted while Charles was at Highgrove, turned the estate from sanctuary into scandal overnight. What should have been private intimacy became public spectacle, fueling a media frenzy that still lingers in royal memory. By 1995, Diana had formally moved out, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Charles, no longer bound by the ghost of a fractured marriage, began to reshape Highgrove's interiors to reflect his own tastes and, eventually, Camilla's. Rooms once associated with a strained partnership were reimagined into spaces of comfort and continuity. Through all this, the gardens remained Charles's steady companion. While marriages faltered and scandals erupted, the plants kept growing, the meadows kept swaying, and the estate continued to evolve. Highgrove, like its owner, absorbed the storms and adapted. In many ways, the house mirrored Charles's life during those years, caught between duty and desire, between the public facade and the private heart. And as the fairy tale of Diana faded into heartbreak, Highgrove quietly transformed itself again, preparing for the woman who would eventually walk through its doors not as scandal, but as queen. When Diana closed the doors of Highgrove behind her in 1995, the estate might easily have been reduced to a royal mausoleum, forever shadowed by the memory of a failed marriage. But for Charles, it became something else. A blank page. He began to reclaim the house, room by room, garden by garden, turning it into a canvas for his beliefs and, eventually, a home he could finally share openly with Camilla. The transformation was not sudden but gradual, like the slow growth of a tree. At first, Highgrove became Charles's bachelor retreat, a place where he could immerse himself in the comfort of routine, the solace of the land, and the endless work of his gardens. Here, he could breathe without the scrutiny of royal courtiers, without the constant reminder of a marriage that had collapsed under the world's gaze. But as Camilla's presence in his life moved from whispered scandal to accepted reality, Highgrove shifted once again. Slowly, the interiors reflected not just his taste, but theirs. The furniture softened, the spaces warmed, and the atmosphere changed from one of isolation to one of companionship. The estate's evolution mirrored their relationship, once hidden, then tentative, and finally confident. Through all these transitions, the gardens remained the estate's heartbeat. They carried on regardless of headlines, continuing to evolve according to Charles's environmental vision. If walls can absorb scandal, hedges can absorb sorrow. The roses bloomed, the meadows swayed, and in their constancy, Charles found a rhythm of stability that human relationships often failed to provide. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Highgrove had quietly become more than a private retreat. It was a manifesto in practice, a living laboratory where Charles could prove that sustainability was not a romantic ideal but a practical necessity. Long before world leaders gathered to debate climate change, he was planting wildflowers and composting kitchen waste, stubbornly pursuing a vision that many dismissed as eccentric. Highgrove, with its organic farm and carefully restored landscapes, stood as his reply to the skeptics. When Charles and Camilla finally married in 2005, Highgrove became their shared sanctuary. If their first morning together symbolized triumph over years of hostility and rumor, the years that followed cemented the estate as a symbol of resilience. The place once associated with whispered phone calls and tabloid scandal was now celebrated as a model of environmental stewardship and traditional English country living. Today, Highgrove is no longer simply a house. It is both a stage and a sanctuary. A stage for Charles's lifelong environmental advocacy, and a sanctuary where he can retreat from the relentless demands of monarchy. In its gardens, he found continuity. In its rooms, he found companionship. And in its legacy, he built something far greater than a private estate. The story of Highgrove after Diana is, in truth, the story of Charles himself. A man once defined by scandal now finds himself defined by sustainability. A prince once accused of eccentricity now wears a crown of vindication. And it all began, not in palaces of gold, but in the soil, hedges, and meadows of a quiet Georgian house in Gloucestershire. But Highgrove's transformation is not only personal, it is public. For today, this estate does not belong solely to the king. It also belongs, in part, to the thousands who walk its gardens each year, to the charities it sustains, and to the lessons it quietly teaches the world. If Highgrove once symbolized secrecy and scandal, today it represents transparency and service. What was once the most scrutinized private home in Britain has become, remarkably, one of the most visited royal estates, opening its gates each year to tens of thousands of curious guests. And in doing so, it has redefined what it means for a royal residence to belong both to the crown and to the people. Beyond the manicured gardens lies 1,000 acres of farmland that may be less glamorous to look at, but they tell perhaps the most important part of Highgrove's story. Known as Duchy Home Farm, this land has been farmed under organic principles since the 1980s, back when such practices were seen as eccentric, even laughable. Charles, however, pressed on, convinced that soil health, rare breed conservation, and seed preservation mattered far more than short-term profit. In 1994, the farm achieved full organic certification, an extraordinary milestone at a time when organic was still a niche word. Its produce became the backbone of Duchy Originals, a brand Charles founded to prove that sustainable farming could also be commercially viable. Today, rebranded as Duchy Organic and sold through Waitrose, it is one of the UK's most successful organic food ranges, bringing his environmental vision to supermarket shelves across the nation. But Duchy Home Farm has never been about business alone. Rare breeds are preserved here, heritage meats are raised with care, and heirloom seeds are cultivated to protect biodiversity. At Barley Court, a restored 17th century farmhouse, training programs teach young people traditional building skills, ensuring that old craftsmanship is not lost in a modern world. What began as a prince's personal experiment is now regarded as a model of sustainable agriculture. For Charles, it is proof that privilege can be repurposed, that a royal estate can feed not just the table, but also the future. Today, Highgrove is more than a royal country house. It is a symbol, a place that has endured fire, neglect, scandal, and reinvention, yet emerged as one of the most admired estates in Britain. For King Charles III, it is deeply personal, the estate where he raised his sons, where he nurtured his marriage to Camilla, and where he proved that environmental stewardship could flourish under the weight of monarchy. What makes Highgrove remarkable is how it has evolved with its owner. Once a family home, then a bachelor's retreat, and now a king's sanctuary, the estate reflects the man himself, once dismissed as eccentric, now celebrated as visionary. The gardens and farmland stand as his greatest legacy, living proof that tradition and sustainability can reinforce one another rather than conflict. Even as Charles wears the crown, he remains a tenant here, leasing Highgrove from Prince William under a peppercorn arrangement. That quirk of royal finance underscores a larger truth. No matter who holds the deeds, Highgrove belongs to history now. Its influence stretches far beyond Gloucestershire, inspiring visitors, farmers, and policymakers across the world. And the story is not finished. Planning applications for new greenhouses and expanded educational programs show that the estate is still growing, still teaching, still experimenting. In time, Highgrove may be remembered less as the private refuge of a king, and more as the place where an heir turned his obsession with soil, plants, and heritage into a philosophy that outlived him. The question remains, will future monarchs embrace this vision? Or will Highgrove always be Charles's estate, inseparable from the man who gave it life? And so we return to Highgrove, a Georgian house of stone and symmetry, wrapped in gardens that whisper their secrets through every bloom. What began as a gentleman's retreat has, over 2 centuries, become something extraordinary. The private kingdom of a monarch who chose to define himself not through pomp, but through planting. For Charles, Highgrove was never simply about walls or windows. It was about vision. It was about proving that beauty, heritage, and sustainability could live side by side. Walk its lawns, and you can feel the layers of its story. The ashes of the 1893 fire, the echoes of Diana's laughter, the hush of scandal, and the quiet triumph of a man who refused to let ridicule or rumor drown out his convictions. Today, those same grounds welcome thousands of visitors each year, not to marvel at marble, but to learn how soil, seeds, and stewardship can shape a better future. Perhaps that is Highgrove's greatest achievement, reminding us that legacy is not built on titles or crowns, but on the choices we make, the land we nurture, and the values we leave behind. Before watching this, had you ever imagined that one of Britain's most influential royal estates would be defined not by chandeliers or banquet halls, but by wildflowers, compost heaps, and organic vegetables? Do you see Highgrove as Charles's private retreat, or as his public gift to the world? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us again for more untold stories hidden behind gilded gates and ivy-covered walls.